Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. What is the importance of showcasing history through drama and movies? As we see more options to choose from to take a peek into the lives of nomads and rulers of the Ottoman Empire, how does this impact our understanding of who and what came before us? And what really goes into the work of this art? Let's talk about this more on our show today. Joining us for this conversation today is Mr. Yusuf Erim, who's an analyst with TRT World and producer of several documentaries, including The Network, Syria, The Backstage, a documentary about the Syrian civil war. He joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us today is Mr. Yaqoob Khan Bangash, who's a historian of modern South Asia. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Yaqoob Khan Bangash, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about the portrayal of history through this medium, do you think it gives us space, gives us leverage to portray history in a different form that would be constricted if we say, if we wrote it in books or it was portrayed through, for example, artwork in galleries?
First, thank you for having me on your show. And I think this is a very important topic to discuss because, of course, now through mass media, history has begun to have a larger impact. It's a useful medium because, of course, a lot of people get bored by reading books, but then there are also popular books of history written by a number of authors, and they have actually done very good business. So, yes, writing is kind of a tedious process, and of course, they are very dense historical books. But in terms of writing, you can also find lots of good material now and very readable material. Where this media has helped us understand things is it has helped us visualize that age. So one of the most fascinating things that one finds through these kinds of period dramas is, depending on if they are well researched and well formulated, is that we get a taste of the age, we get to see the costume, we get to see what kind of life they had, what kind of discussions did they have, what were their issues. So this is something that we call public history, in trying to engage the public with history and trying to engage them with what happened in the past so that we can learn and go on from it. There's a problem with that, of course, because a lot of period dramas, by the end of it, are dramas. So one of the problems that really emerges, and I find it in my teaching all the time, is that people watch the drama and think that all of that is completely true. Now that creates a huge problem because most of it is, some of it is true, but a lot of it is dramatized, not really true. A lot of it is sort of added in, and that creates a fake sense of history. That creates a fake sense of the past, which creates a very fake memory in the minds of people, which actually creates a lot of problems then solved.
And Mr. Bangash, we're going to talk more about what really do you mean when you say a false sense of history, and what problems can that create in the minds of the viewers and those who are trying to use this material to understand what happened before. But I want to jump to Mr. Yusuf Erim. Mr. Yusuf Erim, you're talking to us from Istanbul. Of course, Turkish dramas, Turkish viewership has increased tremendously across the world, and it has a lot to do with how history is presented, especially of this part of the world, this region. What do you think is the strengths of Turkish drama and Turkish television?
Well, first, Turkey has an incredibly rich history, starting from the 13th century, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, 1299, to the conquest of Istanbul in 1453, all the way till the end of the expansion period, basically 1683 with the Battle of Vienna. And when we look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, it's not just the history of the Turks. It's a collective history of the region because the empire constituted itself of many minorities, many different religions, and its vast expansion throughout North Africa, throughout the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Basically, that period is not only the history of Turkey, it's also the history of the Muslim world, basically, because it encompassed much of the known Muslim world during its height of its reign. So there's many other people that can relate to that Ottoman history because, like I say, it's not just an ethno-nationalistic history, it's also a religious history as well. So there's this vast majority who can relate. Plus, when we look at historical shows in the past, whether it be any of these American shows, British shows, French shows, we're seeing a Christian history. We're seeing a history of the American Revolution. We're seeing a history of the Buckingham Palace or the English crown. And this is not a history that the East can relate to. This is not something that they can relate to. And when they're seeing the Ottoman sultans, when they're seeing the Janissaries, when they're seeing the Ottoman soldiers and the warriors, when they're seeing the namazgah as the Ottoman Turks are praying, their respect for Islam, their family values, cultural values. This is all something that an Eastern viewer can relate to. And they're seeing this for the first time on TV over the past 10 years where, hey, Muslims are the heroes. Hey, we had this great empire. We had this rich history, and we should celebrate it. Is it embellished like our other guest said? Of course it's embellished. It's TV. It's Hollywood. Everything's embellished. And that's the great part of Hollywood. You can rewrite and you can make these model characters perfect examples of humanity. And you can also have these troubled characters where you can examine them. So I think it's very, very important. And the reason why it's reaching out to the masses is because of that collective history of the Muslim world underneath the roof of the Ottoman Empire. And I think the reason why the West is interested is because it's very, very different to them. They're seeing this for the first time. So it has something to give to an Eastern viewer. It also has something different for a Western viewer, this exotic taste of the Eastern empires. So it's a win-win situation for every viewer who wants to see a period drama.
Right. Mr. Yusuf, Erim, now just talking a little more about that fact that you're talking about how it resonates with such a wide audience that missed out on this content for so long. Also, how is this content, how are these movies, how are these dramas that are produced in different parts of the world also used as forms of soft power, as cultural power? How do you see that influence intervening with politics and greater issues of diplomacy?
Well, I think it's a very, very important part of Turkish soft power. Now, when you look at politically what Turkey's trying to do right now, it showed great interest in areas where it has a rich, deep cultural history, whether it be the Balkans, whether it be the Middle East, the Gulf, or North Africa. These are all areas that were historically part of the Ottoman Empire. And right now, when we're looking at the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's policies, these are areas that are very important to him, whether it be Syria, whether it be Libya, whether it be the Eastern Mediterranean. But when we go back 200-300 years, these were all areas that were very important to the Ottoman Empire as well. So these period dramas are showing people from these areas that, hey, we had a collective history together. We lived together. We worked together. This was areas that were governed by the Turks. So it's creating that bond that we had a shared history together. So it's very important, these types of dramas that are touching on these very important aspects of that shared and collective history. Right.
Mr. Yusuf, I'm just come back to you, and we're going to talk just a little bit about how it works to be a documentary maker, how it actually works when you want to portray history in a certain way. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Bangash and pick up that point in which he talked about history being embellished and when narratives are politicized and when there is a nationalistic tone that plays underneath them, they can also create problems. Mr. Bangash, what did you really mean by that?
Well, if I can just pick up from where the other guest left off, I think that highlights a very important thing because, for example, he said that it is not just Turkish history, but Muslim history and Islamic history. For me, as a South Asian, that's really problematic because if you look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, at its peak, the number of Muslims in the Ottoman Empire were less than a third of the number of Muslims in India. And of course, India had been ruled by Muslim rulers since the 11th century onwards.
Mr. Bangash, Right. Mr. Bangash, I understand that, but since we're short on time, I want to get to the point of how this plays out in the viewer's head, especially now let's put aside the representation issue just for 1 second, and let's try to understand when history, however it relates to the viewer, but when it's presented and when it's embellished and when certain narratives are amended because keeping present context in mind, how does that impact the viewer?
Yeah, so what it does to the viewer is, and I think that's where the problem arises, that 90% of people who watch these dramas have no sense of history. So they take all of that as reality, and that kind of creates a mindset in their mind that this is how history was, this is how things were. So if you see, again, because we are talking about Turkish dramas, when you see the Ottoman Empire and all these dramas show a very, very positive idea of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, all empires were really mixed. They had good and bad bits. But if it doesn't show the massacres that happened in the Ottoman Empire or all the other troubles that associated with it, or with any other empire for that matter, it gives a very skewed vision, and people then tend to believe it, and people then tend to react against it. So when someone kind of counters that argument, they will say, oh no, but I saw that drama, and in that drama it was portrayed in this particular manner, without realizing that it was an embellished kind of a drama. It is also very interesting in terms of gender roles. That's begun to be played, because the whole idea of masculinity and femininity, all these kinds of things, how religion has been interpreted in the past and how it's being interpreted now, begun to have an effect. It has also begun to have an effect how different communities kind of relate to each other. So watching these dramas, which are usually popular, has a huge social impact, and has a huge impact in terms of how we learn and perceive the past, and then how we play that past in our current reality.
In our present and in our future. I take that point. Thank you so much, Mr. Yaqoob Khan Bangash, for joining us, giving us your insight, giving us that historical perspective there. Mr. Yusuf, Erim, as I stated, I want to come back to that point of you and your experiences as a person who works to produce this art form, I would say, this way of storytelling. What are some of the challenges, and what do you think needs to be done to hit it rightly and to portray what you want, the message you want, to be portrayed to the viewer?
I haven't had an opportunity to actually work on a historical piece yet. Much of what I've worked on is more current affairs, but it's very important to go into producing a documentary with an open mind. Don't go in there thinking something, because whatever you're thinking definitely changes once you start diving deeper into the subject matter, talking with people that were part of the decision-making process. If it's an event, if it's a person, talking about people who are very close to that person. So it's very important to keep an open mind. It's very important to dive deep into the subject matter. Find the right people to work with, obviously. That, I think, is the most important thing, because this is not just a 2 or 3 or 5 minute news interview. You're going, when you're doing a documentary, it's more long form. It's a minimum of, if it's for TV, about 25 to 26 minutes, maybe multiple episodes. Documentaries I've worked on have been multiple episodes, or 2 hours or longer. And these are projects that take about a year or longer, year or more time. So it's a very in-depth project when we look at what the daily news consumption versus a documentary. And it's, like I said, it's most important to go in with a very open mind. Don't go in with any type of preset conditions saying, oh, this is what I'm expecting, because things rarely turn out, or rarely are as they meet the eye once you dig deep when you're creating a documentary.
Right. Mr. Yusuf, on that point, when you say that it's important to go in with an open mind, how difficult is it to try to keep those preconceived notions, especially when you're talking about current affairs and the narratives that circulate around it, which an individual really doesn't know until they dive deeper into the story, see it for what it is? How does a documentary maker, a producer, a director keep those things at bay?
Actually, very hard. I mean, we're constantly bombarded by narratives. And when you work in the news, you're obviously much better trained than the average viewer to spot these narratives that you're being bombarded with. So I can't imagine how the average viewer must feel when they're constantly being under this barrage of just political narratives, just thought trying to be placed in their mind. So as a producer, as a director, as an advisor for these types of documentaries, I try to keep everything out of my mind and just look at everything as I'm investigating a court case. I try to keep that type of context, that type of feeling in my mind as it's some type of court case, and I am a juror. So I like to be a juror, and I like to listen to both sides. I want to make sure I get voices that are pro and that are con the subject matter, and I like to keep them balanced. But usually it does, however hard you do try, it does end up leaning or going towards a certain direction. And that's just human nature.
Right. I understand that. So, like, there are many individuals who would be hearing this as well, who aspire towards going on that path of digging deeper into the realities that surround us, the realities that came before us. What would your advice be to those individuals who have that aspiration?
First thing, get started. Put material out there, put content out there. In the end, experience is very, very important. Where you are today and where you're going to be 2, 3, 4 years down the line, when you look at your current self, you will realize how much you've improved over that time period. And just constantly putting out work, constantly putting out content. Also working on quality projects. When I mean constantly putting out, quality is always more important than quantity, especially for me. I'm always looking for quality projects, projects that need to be told, stories that need to be told. So it's very important to find that subject matter that can resonate with masses as well. One of the subject matters that we worked on this previous year was the Khashoggi murder. I thought that was a very important topic for the world. It dominated global headlines for 2 to 3 months. Right. It dominated headlines like the coronavirus has dominated headlines, and right. To think that was a murder investigation. So it's something that resonated with many people, and hopefully you'll be able to watch that soon. That will premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January, and we're waiting to work with a streaming distributor to actually bring that to the masses. It hasn't happened yet due to certain types of pressure coming from certain countries. I don't want to talk more about it. But
we're, anyway, as like viewers, right, we as viewers are looking forward to watching that. Thank you so much, Mr. Yusuf Erim, for joining us, taking out the time to talk to us. Now we're joined by Mr. Tony Pollard, who's a professor of conflict history and archaeology director at the Center for Battlefield Archaeology at the University of Glasgow. He joins us from Glasgow. Thank you so much, Professor Pollard, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about how the representation of history in the form of movies and TV dramas plays out in the minds of the viewers, and also you as a person who studies history in depth. How do you see this, the impact of this? Do you see it as being overwhelmingly positive, or do you feel like the embellishment of history, in fact, can be damaging?
Hello, it's great to be here. I have a foot in both camps, really. I'm an academic historian and archaeologist, and so I teach students how to critique history, how to investigate the past. But on the other hand, I also write historical fiction. So I'm a novelist and have I published one novel. I suppose that makes me a novelist. But that was a historical drama, and it was based on historical fact. It was about the Victorian engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. But it was highly embellished, and I used the characters within that, Florence Nightingale, Charles Darwin, to create basically a detective thriller. And I didn't have a problem with meshing both fact and fiction. In fact, I set myself the challenge as a writer to fool the reader. I wanted the reader to think, is this real, or is this part that he's made up? And indeed it worked, because I had a historian at one point asking me which archives I had found to tell one part of the story. So I can be a little mischievous, but I think it is a serious question. And some historians are very negative about historical fiction, be it writing or TV dramas and movies. But again, I've become involved. I've been the historical advisor I was the historical advisor, for instance, on the first 2 series of the TV show Outlander. I was one of the historical advisors on the Netflix movie Outlaw King. So it's something that I'm very interested in, but I am all the time aware of the liberties that these dramas take with history. And for instance, Outlander, I was brought on to that job by the showrunner, by the producer, because I was a recognized expert in the Jacobite period in 18th century Scotland, which is where the series is mostly set. And I was also a novelist. So he said to me when he came to my office at the university, he said, we would like you to advise us on this series. It's going to be huge. We didn't know then how huge. And he said, one of the reasons we want you to come on board is not because you're an expert in the period, that's important, but you're also a novelist, you know how narrative works, and you have not shied away from taking liberties.
Right.
So my job there was to take the scripts in draft and read through them before any production of them started and make notes and say, this is historically inaccurate, this is how this would happen, this is how that document would read.
Mr. Tony Pollard, I'm so interested in knowing more about the work you've been doing in the past, and especially about your take on historical fiction. But I have to also introduce another guest who's joined us, Bruce E. Baker, who's a reader in American history at Newcastle University. He's the author and editor of a number of books on the history of American South, most recently with Barbara Hann. Now, he joins us from Scotland. Thank you so much, Mr. Baker, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about narratives. We've been talking about how the portrayal of history through drama and TV series plays out in the audience's mind and the value of that, really. Now, a point that Mr. Pollard brought up, which was very interesting, was the use of narratives to see whether they're correct or not. How important is the power that is given to retell narratives in this way, creatively in this way, those that are not directed by the state, are not directed by historians, which have had a lot of power over academic circles, let's say?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to think about all the different sources of narratives about history. So those would include sort of formal things controlled by government, so kind of public speeches on historical occasions and things like that. It would also include sort of mass media, things like very successful historical dramas like Outlander and so forth. But we also get narratives about the past from a lot of different sources, and those would include, stories that our older family members and neighbors tell us, and so forth. So I think certainly the things that I've been interested in studying, one of the things I'm really interested in is the differences between those sort of local informal narratives that circulate amongst communities and family members and so forth, and the things that come from sort of very formal official channels, like a government deciding to have a national day of remembrance of something or putting up a monument to something, and then also the sorts of things that we learn about history through mediums like novels and film and so forth, because those are all operating at different levels, I would say.
Right. Tony Pollard, on that point of there, that was being discussed with Mr. Baker about the narratives and how different forms speak differently to different people in this. I want to go back to what you talked about historical fiction and put that with this question. How important is that power for a storyteller to have, to use such a medium like historical fiction to rewrite some of the narratives, challenge some of the narratives that we've been hearing for so long?
Well, I think it's a privilege for writers and producers and broadcasters, and it's one that can be exploited. But I think if it's used correctly and it's balanced, what you can do is you can encourage people to take an interest in history. Now, Outlander, as I was talking about, it's very much set within a historical period, within the Jacobite rebellions. But it's based on a series of novels. And as I was reading the scripts, I would go, right, that's wrong, that's wrong. There are no wolves in Scotland in 1743. They've been extinct for almost 50 years. And I would send those notes back, and they would say, well, for one thing, the wolves are in the novel, so they've got to be in the book. And basically, I came to terms with the fact that there were elements within the drama, and I'm not talking about the books, I was involved in the TV drama, which I just had to let go. I did my best to ensure historical accuracy, but it was a piece of fiction. And at the end of the day, Outlander is actually science fiction because it's about a woman who travels back through in time. So you can pick pieces out of it and say that's totally inaccurate. Other bits are surprisingly accurate. My hope as an advisor and a historian is it will encourage people, viewers, to go and read about the actual historical events. Right. And as we know, history as written by historians can also be peppered with bias and errors.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Tony Pollard, for joining us, taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Baker, on that point of the fact that historians themselves, when they write history in things that don't involve work of fiction, that also can be peppered with biases. It can be peppered with many other perspectives. Now, when you talk about reconstruction of history and trying to read about it and trying to learn about it from a retrospective point of view, what are some of the things that, as a reader of history, you try to keep in mind and that you would advise to people who are reading back on history?
Well, I think one of the things, in some ways, I would just suggest going back to basics in terms of historians, fundamentally, whatever period we study and so forth. We start out by looking at primary source documents, right? So we look at documents which might be letters or political statements or newspaper articles or all sorts of things that were created by people at the time. And we start with those. We also take oral history interviews very seriously as primary source documents and sort of think about all the things we know about how individual memory sort of shapes representations of the past and so forth. But nowadays, there was certainly a time when those sorts of primary source documents were, hidden away in archives, or, newspaper articles were on reels of microfilm that were really hard to access and so forth. But nowadays, to be honest, sitting here in lockdown in my home in rural Scotland, I can access more primary source documents about the things that I research than I could with days in a library 15 or 20 years ago. And of course, that ability is available to all of us. So I would encourage people who are watching some sort of historical drama about a topic that they're interested in to, start by looking at, what do the historians, say about this, where we operate with peer review, which means that when I write something before it's published, a lot of other historians pick it apart in the way that Professor Pollard was saying. He sort of picks apart the novels before the TV program is made. Well, they go through and try to, correct the errors that I might make and argue with the points that I make. So I would say seek out those sorts of things that are peer reviewed,
right.
And then follow it back to the documents and have a look at the actual documents yourself. There's no reason why everybody who's watching Outlander can't go back and find some of those same original sources that the historians use.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Bruce E. Baker, for joining us, talking to us, giving us your insight on this topic. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we talk about history being showcased through the lens of films and shows, now joining us for this conversation is Dr. Kris Galloway, who's a communication expert joining us from Auckland. Also joining us today is Mr. Nirvaan Nadeem, who is the director of Ajoka Institute and deputy director of Ajoka Theatre in Pakistan. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Nirvaan, I'd like to begin with you. Now, we've been talking about movies and dramas, and you, of course, work and focus more on theatre. But it is an interesting comparison to have. How do you think history is portrayed differently in both mediums?
Well, art, if we start off with just a small discussion about art itself and its importance. Apart from it making you into a better human being, because obviously to be an artist, to be any creative person, first and foremost, has to empathize with the characters, with other people. So apart from making you into a better person, it also has a variety of other benefits for society and civilization itself as a whole. Unfortunately, that is something that we as a society are not too keen on the importance of art, of any art form. This serial, which has become very popular, and any other period dramas, they are a prime example to showcase the importance of any art form regarding, be it painting, be it music, be it dramas, be them films. So their importance is that these art forms basically preserve the history and culture of entire civilizations so that they are remembered throughout the ages and something that we can learn from.
Right. Nirvaan, when you work in the Ajoka Theatre, what is your main aim? To showcase history, but also to bring about social issues to the forefront. How do you feel like you can do that effectively?
Well, you see, truly great art is not just about entertainment. Truly great art touches the soul. It gives you something to think about. It gives something for society itself to think about, because truly great art is always a reflection of society. So we at Ajoka for the past over 3 decades have, in spite of many obstacles from the government, from extremists, but we have always strived to say something through our theater, through our art forms, be it women rights, be it minority rights, human rights, be it extremism in all its forms. And you see the benefit of using these art forms to say what you want to say and affect a difference in society is that the other person does not get defensive. And through these art forms, you can convey your message and try your best to change society in a meaningful way.
Right. Stay with me, and I'm going to jump to Dr. Kris Calloway. Dr. Kris Calloway, we've heard how Nirvaan speaks very passionately about how theater expresses various emotions and the need to have it in society. Now, you work with various mediums of communication. How do you think art speaks out uniquely to individuals, especially when we talk about them empathizing and them being able to see certain narratives in a different sort of a light?
I think one of the interesting things about theatre and the film industry in New Zealand is that it has grown up as our nation has grown up from the status of being a British colony to being a proudly independent nation today. And that's been reflected in the growth of our domestic film industry, in theatre and in literature. And these all kind of intersect to show a growing maturity and a growing self-confidence. It used to be said that New Zealand had a kind of colonial cringe, and I don't think that is there anymore. We have seen literally Oscar award-winning activity here in the film industry. We have seen a vibrant theatre and art and more generally artistic community develop and find its own voice rather than the voice of colonialism.
Right. Now, you're picking up a very interesting point, the fact that it doesn't have that colonial cringe to it anymore. How long did that work take to get there? I mean, the process of colonization, and especially when you're trying to decolonize art, whether it comes in the form of films or movies or whatever, that takes a long process. How do you think New Zealand successfully got there?
I think it's happened in the last 2, maybe 3 or 4 decades, actually, when there has been a renaissance, a flowering, if you like, of the art and self-consciousness of our indigenous people, the Māori. And as they have found their own feet, as it were, in the artistic world as well as in other spheres, it has encouraged the development of the wider artistic community that I talked about before. We have now famous film directors like Taika Waititi and Peter Jackson of the Lord of the Rings fame. But underneath all of that, there is a very diverse industry involved in shooting TV series and major films. And this is only part of what has become a very, I'm struggling for the right word here, but New Zealand has found its way of expressing itself in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 decades.
Nirvaan, sorry, Dr. Kris Calloway, to cut you off from there, but whatever you're saying, I think it really resonates with our part here as well, because the process of decolonization, it's almost a global experience considering how many nations it impacted. Nirvaan, just picking up on that point and talking about the pressure to communicate your own indigenous culture when there are so many other competing films, movies of various other cultures. Do you feel that pressure?
You see, one of the most stark benefits of these art forms, of promoting your own art forms, is that not only is your own culture and history preserved, but you can export it to the rest of the world as well. You can tell the rest of the world your stories, your triumphs, your failures. So these stories, through these stories, you can convey your narrative and promote your own cause. So if you look, for example, at the United States or any such civilization, they did not, in a way, conquer the world through their armies. They conquered the world through their art forms. That is how they grabbed the mindset of literally the entire world. So we as a nation, we as Pakistanis also need to realize the power that all these art forms, be it filmmaking, painting, art, music, they have.
Right. Thank you so much, Ron and Nadeem, for joining us from Lahore and talking to us about this. Dr. Kris Calloway, just one last question from you. Now, how important and vital do you think this form is, especially in bringing about understanding of various different cultures across the world, and especially when we talk about how divisive our politics is these days? How much unity do you think these various forms of communication hold?
I think the potential for that kind of unity is there. I can really only confidently speak of the New Zealand experience, where the government has invested quite significantly in the development of the film industry and the development of various forms of expression of the Māori, that is the indigenous people's language, through a national television channel devoted to Māori language, through tribal radio stations, through the encouragement of different forms of media. So it has not been left to the market to determine this. It has been with government support, and there is a national agency called New Zealand On Air, which is responsible for funding programming of different sorts that expresses where New Zealand sees itself now. So I think it's a matter of a government having the vision to see the importance of this whole area and put some money where its mouth might well be.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Kris Galloway, for joining us from Auckland. Now we're joined by Carl Zha, who's an analyst regarding culture in China. He joins us from Bali. Thank you so much, Carl, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, you take a lot of interest in the history of China. You take a lot of interest in the history of Asia, viewing it through various mediums. How do you feel like film appeals to you as a viewer? And what do you think it embeds in the mind of the viewer?
Oh, I think, film is a great medium because people are visual animals. And, we can read, but when it's presented on the silver screen, it really connects with people at a deeper level.
Talking about that deeper level and how culture is used through various forms, especially when we're talking about films by different countries across the world. Do you think it provides an opportunity of exhibiting soft power, of trying to mold certain narratives in a powerful way? Do you see that as a viewer when you're watching a film? Does that cross your mind?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially in the age of internet, people have all across the world that have access to films and TV dramas all across the world from different cultures. I, from the comfort of my own home, I can go online and watch TV dramas from Turkey, from India, from Pakistan, from China. And in today's multipolar world, there's a lot more production coming online from what previously known as third world countries, right? There's now China, India, Turkey, many other emerging markets have really become like a for cultural export country of their own, and we're experiencing that right now.
Right, Carl, I'm interested about the film scene within China now. China is often seen as a very closed-off community in terms of the internet and other various reasons. How is the film scene like in China, and how much control is there for directors and producers to take hold of the creative reins?
Yes, that's a great question. Because as we know, there is censorship in China. There is a control. There's quotas for a number of foreign films that can be imported into China. But that just applies to the films that show in big screen in theaters. But the internet is wide open. In fact, I mean, I have seen the Indian TV series Mahabharat in China on Chinese video streaming platforms. And in fact, many of these platforms they have fans who fan sub, from various different languages, whether English, Hindi, Urdu, Turkish. I mean, like as China get wealthier, more more media is actually available nowadays, especially through the internet.
Right. I was talking to our guests earlier about the fact that for a very long time, what we saw on television, or at least in mainstream entertainment, and when we're talking about reflections of history, it was always the discourses that belonged and came from the Western and European spheres. And now it seems like that's being challenged with greater movies and greater films being produced, whether it is in China or Turkey or Pakistan or India, from all these places. How do you think the impact of this has been on the global sphere of pop culture and entertainment? Do you think that's being challenged? Do you think that's being changed? Or is it just more voices in the conversation, but there's still clear hegemony with American entertainment or European entertainment?
Well, I mean, Hollywood has a huge monopoly on entertainment worldwide, just because of the huge amount of both the soft and hard power enjoyed by United States. And that is changing today, and especially as many Asian countries have become wealthier and being able to tell their own stories. We've seen that in India, Pakistan, Turkey, and China, and in the age of internet, people in United States, in the West, they can access those mediums. They can access these cultural exports from Asia,
right,
with subtitles. And that, I mean, like K-pop was not a thing 10, 20 years ago.
But now we see it taking over all the world. I take that point there. Thank you so much, Carl, for joining us and talking to us about this. Now we're joined by Mr. Amir Wani, who's a photographer, filmmaker, and poet from Srinagar, Kashmir. He has been awarded India's Best Travel Photographer by Travel Leisure and the M-Billionth Award by DEF and UN World Awards. He has started his famous Instagram channel, Kashmir Through My Lens. He's talking to us from Paris right now. Thank you so much, Aamir, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, I just want to get to it. How do you think your form of artwork expresses the history and the story of Kashmir?
You see, first of all, thank you for having me. The important thing what we have to understand about Kashmir is because Kashmir is such a complex issue, and because of the politics involved, it has always been what Bollywood has always done is taken our stories and told them to the audiences, which majority of the times, not surprisingly, are inaccurate. And I think we need to take it, in our own hands and to tell our stories ourselves. And that's what we are trying to do here, including me. And there are other, artists and filmmakers who are sort of working towards it, because what we want to do is reclaim the narrative.
Right.
And over the years, what Bollywood, Indian government, Indian state uses Bollywood as a tool. It is a soft power for them, and to propagate, their propaganda about Kashmir. And so I think what we have done is, and what we are trying to do is, take our stories and present them ourselves, the way we see them, the way we feel them, and the way we live them. And that's, I'm doing my part in that. Yeah.
Right. And
I think...
And I've your Instagram, the pictures are absolutely brilliant. Aamir, just one last question. What does that act of reclaiming narratives and stories mean? You as a Kashmiri, I'm talking about the fact that not only it's a story for the world to see the actuality, but for your own selves. What does that emotion mean to reclaim that space, to reclaim that narrative?
it is very important for us as a Kashmiri, for me to, because when I talk to people about Kashmir, they are they don't know what's happening there, what the reality is, especially the Indian masters. And when I when I tell them what actually happens, and then they sort of understand, okay, where this is coming from. The thing is, with the word that I use, reclaiming narrative, it's very important to us because we feel like we've been slowly, what the Indian state has been doing is trying to rip us off our identity, and it's important for us to hold on to that identity and not give up on that. And that's, I think, where it comes. Like, we want to reclaim that, this is our place, this is our story, these are our stories, and we need to tell them ourselves and
our
not
way.
someone else.
Right. Those are powerful words. Aamir, Wani, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck to your endeavor and your future prospects as a filmmaker, your future adventures, and I hope that you find all the success in your cause. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.